December 1941. While German soldiers were freezing in their positions outside Moscow, and fresh Soviet divisions appeared from seemingly nowhere to unleash a crushing counterattack, Chief of Staff Franz Halder documented what was allegedly Hitler's admission: "We have now lost the war." Whether those were his exact words remains debated among historians. But the moment signified the collapse of a fantasy. The fantasy that 3,350 German tanks could somehow subjugate a nation deploying 10 to 13,000 of their own. That racial ideology could replace actual intelligence. That boundless confidence could somehow defeat mathematical reality. June 22, 1941. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet frontier in history's largest military invasion. Adolf Hitler was certain that triumph was guaranteed. His conviction wasn't merely strategic, it was ideological. The Führer had assured his generals that the Soviet state would disintegrate on contact. A single hard kick, he promised, and the entire decrepit edifice would crumble. The numbers reveal a delusion of staggering proportions. Germany advanced with 3,350 tanks, a devastating force that had demolished France. But German intelligence had repeatedly miscalculated Soviet reserves and manufacturing power. They confronted somewhere between 10,000 and 13,000 Soviet tanks, a ratio of 3 or 4 to 1. This wasn't a modest oversight, it was a catastrophe born from ideology. The racist conviction that Slavic peoples couldn't possibly have constructed military machinery of this magnitude. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch reviewed the intelligence assessments his officers presented. The reports appeared to validate what Nazi racial doctrine already assumed. The Soviets were disorganized, primitive, and incapable of prolonged combat. The Red Army's poor showing against Finland had only reinforced this poisonous overconfidence. Wehrmacht officers assured one another, "If the Finns embarrass the Red Army, we'll obliterate it." General Franz Halder, Army Chief of Staff, conceived Operation Barbarossa as the supreme Blitzkrieg. 3 enormous army groups would thrust north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south into resource-rich Ukraine. The identical methods that had paralyzed Europe would now annihilate what Hitler termed Judeo-Bolshevism and claim the Lebensraum he'd pledged in Mein Kampf. The Luftwaffe committed 2,770 aircraft, anticipating air supremacy within days. Every projection indicated rapid victory. Yet the planning harbored critical defects that ideological blindness had obscured entirely. Soviet railway gauges were incompatible with German ones. Every kilometer of track required manual conversion, station by station, causing devastating delays as supply chains extended past their limits. German vehicles engineered for Western European highways would encounter mud and Arctic temperatures they were never designed to withstand. The logistical calculations simply didn't balance, but nobody was willing to acknowledge it. Most fatally, German intelligence had systematically minimized Soviet industrial strength and the regime's determination to fight. This wasn't dispassionate analysis, it was prejudice disguised as expertise. The T-34, with its angled 45mm armor, 76mm cannon, and exceptional mobility, significantly outperformed German Panzer IIIs in action. The KV-1, mounting a 76mm gun behind up to 90mm of armor, proved nearly impervious to standard German anti-tank weapons. But German strategists rejected early accounts of these vehicles as absurd exaggerations. Hitler's ideological obsessions had blinded his leadership to tactical reality. This wasn't simply a military operation. It was a holy war against an adversary the Führer was convinced couldn't resist, couldn't adapt, and couldn't prevail. Every assumption originated from that contaminated well of certainty. From his headquarters, Hitler examined maps displaying the triple-pronged assault. He informed his inner circle the campaign would conclude before winter. The Red Army would collapse in weeks, precisely as France had in 6. As German columns raced eastward through summer heat, seizing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and pushing forward up to 1,000 kilometers, with the velocity that had terrified Europe. The earliest fractures in the illusion were already emerging. They were visible only to those honest enough to recognize them. German soldiers started writing letters home, portraying a conflict unlike what they'd been promised. "We advance, but the enemy refuses to shatter," one officer recorded in his diary. "For every Soviet division we eliminate, 2 more materialize. Where are they originating?" The answer, Soviet industrial capacity and reserves that German intelligence had sworn didn't exist, was about to become horrifyingly apparent. Despite penetrating deep into Soviet territory and capturing roughly 2.5 to 3 million prisoners by December, German forces were hemorrhaging through 1,000 wounds. The Blitzkrieg that had conquered France in 6 weeks was seizing up, not through spectacular battlefield reversal, but through the relentless arithmetic of mechanical collapse and logistical impossibility. German tanks and trucks built for Western European pavement were falling apart in Russian conditions. The autumn Rasputitsa transformed roads into bottomless swamps of clinging mud that devoured vehicles entirely. Panzer divisions that had sprinted across Poland and France now sat paralyzed. Mechanical breakdowns exceeded combat casualties. Wrecked equipment lined the advance routes like a trail of debris marking the Wehrmacht's deadly overreach. Soldiers watched their trucks sink to the axles. They witnessed tanks that had conquered nations sitting impotent, their treads choked with mud that froze solid after dark. The logistical emergency became existential. German forces burned fuel faster than it could be hauled over converted railways and insufficient truck convoys. Frontline units received mere fractions of required ammunition, rations and fuel. Some divisions went days without resupply, their troops scavenging from abandoned vehicles and seized Soviet depots. Lieutenant Hans Roth wrote in his diary, "We are marching into emptiness. The further we push, the less we possess. How do you conquer a country when you cannot sustain your own soldiers?" Then arrived the technological revelation that demolished German faith in their material advantage. General Heinz Guderian's memoirs described the instant his panzer crews initially clashed with Soviet T-34 tanks. The sloped armor rejected German rounds. The 76mm cannons punctured Panzer III plating like cardboard. The T-34's 53 km/h speed outran anything in the German arsenal. The KV-1 heavy tanks proved even more terrifying. 90mm of armor that German anti-tank rounds simply ricocheted from. Guderian's tank commanders reported back stunned. "Our shells won't penetrate," one wrote. "We struck them 5 or 6 times, nothing. Then they rotated their turret and we were finished." These weren't the obsolete wrecks German intelligence had predicted. These were machines that surpassed the Panzer IIIs and matched or exceeded Panzer IVs in firepower. Where had they originated? How many more waited? The strategic miscalculations amplified the operational disasters. Hitler's choice to redirect forces from Moscow toward capturing Kiev in autumn cost the Wehrmacht vital weeks, arguably the final opportunity to seize the Soviet capital before winter delivered its Siberian reserves. Field commanders objected. Their war diaries overflow with warnings about the encroaching cold, about troops without winter gear, and about an enemy that refused to accept its own destruction. Franz Halder's diary entries from this period reveal escalating alarm. June's confident forecasts had deteriorated into logistical catastrophe. He documented fierce arguments with Hitler, who denied the mounting emergency. The Führer maintained that determination would compensate for material deficits. Halder understood otherwise. He could interpret the supply tallies. He could observe the casualty figures climbing weekly. October 1941, 685,000 German casualties since June. The Wehrmacht had sacrificed 1/5 of its Eastern Front strength, with no means to replace them. Soviet losses ran higher, millions, yet their reserves appeared limitless. General Eduard Wagner, the Wehrmacht's quartermaster, computed that his supply lines could sustain an advance only to Smolensk, 650 kilometers from the frontier. Moscow lay another 400 kilometers beyond. Type resigned, intensity medium. The mathematics were elementary, unavoidable, and dismissed. Then temperatures began plummeting, not gradually, but catastrophically. -20°C, -30°C, -40°C. German soldiers without winter uniforms froze to death at their posts. Tank engines refused to ignite. Weapons seized with congealed lubricant. Machine guns had to be urinated on just to thaw them for operation. The confident army that had invaded Russia in June had become a frozen, frantic force, fighting merely to survive. The Red Army counteroffensive commencing December 5th wasn't merely a tactical surprise, it was an existential shock. Fresh Siberian divisions, properly outfitted for winter combat, struck German forces already at their limits. These weren't the broken remnants German propaganda had described. These were rested troops with insulated clothing, functioning weapons, and the resolve to fight. The Wehrmacht's front began fracturing. Heinz Guderian depicted the scene. The cold had plunged to -63°F. We fought in conditions that seemed extraterrestrial. Panzer crews watched helplessly as their tanks were swarmed by Soviet infantry gliding on skis, materializing like phantoms across the frozen wasteland. Complete German battalions simply vanished, not overwhelmed in combat, but frozen solid where they stood. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, transmitted increasingly frantic dispatches to Hitler's headquarters. Intensity high. His forces were disintegrating. Frostbite casualties surpassed combat losses. Units reported 50% of vehicles inoperable from cold. Some divisions could muster only several hundred combat-capable soldiers from original rosters of 15,000. The proud Wehrmacht that had dominated Europe was being annihilated not by enemy fire, but by thermometers and supply spreadsheets. Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg became a theater of crisis management and blame. The Führer raged against his generals, denouncing them as cowards and defeatists. He issued his infamous halt order on December 16th, commanding troops to defend every meter of territory, regardless of tactical circumstances. Officers who sanctioned retreats faced courts-martial or execution. This directive, spawned from ideological stubbornness rather than military sense, would pin German forces in impossible positions, hastening their destruction. The psychological toll on the German high command was shattering. These men had subjugated most of Europe. They had considered themselves militarily unstoppable, racially supreme, and historically ordained for victory. Now they witnessed their certainties fragment like frozen metal. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, OKW chief, reportedly contemplated suicide. Brauchitsch suffered cardiac failure and was removed. Guderian was dismissed for permitting a withdrawal. Franz Halder's diary becomes nearly stream of consciousness during these December days, chronicling the avalanche of calamities. Supply trains frozen immobile on tracks. Entire divisions encircled and annihilated. Casualty reports so devastating they seemed fictional. And through everything, Hitler's alleged confession. We have now lost the war. The instant of acknowledgement documented by his chief of staff, even as the Führer would spend years denying it. By late December, Army Group Center had been driven back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The Wehrmacht had absorbed 775,000 casualties, nearly 1/4 of its original invasion strength. Equipment losses proved catastrophic, with thousands of tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces abandoned or destroyed. The legend of German invincibility lay frozen in Russian snow beside the bodies of soldiers who had trusted it. During the weeks following the Moscow counteroffensive, intensity medium. Hitler oscillated between fury, rejection, and frantic justification. He dismissed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. He assumed direct command of the army. He blamed everyone except himself, the weather, his generals, and the unforeseen Soviet reserves. Yet in private moments, associates described a transformed man, older, less certain, and given to brooding silences. He'd glimpsed the truth, even as he would spend his remaining years attempting to reverse it. Franz Halder's diary entries from December 1941 document this psychological collapse in real time. The Chief of Staff recorded Hitler's alleged admission about losing the war. Yet within weeks, the Führer was already devising Case Blue, a fresh summer offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields, as though willpower alone could overturn the mathematics of attrition. This wasn't sudden clarity followed by acceptance. It was incremental recognition followed by pathological denial, a pattern that would characterize German strategy until the Reich's destruction. The recognition itself was neither universal nor simultaneous. While certain senior commanders like Guderian departed the front, persuaded the campaign was unwinnable, many German generals sustained optimism through 1942. The professional officer corps, conditioned to solve tactical puzzles, resisted accepting that no operational brilliance could remedy the fundamental strategic catastrophe. Hitler's reaction to failure exposed more about his nature than his original invasion decision. Rather than acknowledge his ideological blindness, the racist premises that caused him to catastrophically undervalue Soviet capability, he faulted subordinates for inadequate willpower. He progressively meddled in military operations. He forbade tactical withdrawals that might have preserved German forces. Officers recommending retreat faced removal or worse. The Führer, who had conquered Europe through audacious gambles, now imprisoned himself within his own conviction, incapable of admitting error, even as destruction closed around him. General Friedrich Paulus would be commanded to hold Stalingrad at any price in 1942, sacrificing the Sixth Army. Tank crews would be hurled into the slaughter at Kursk in 1943 in a hopeless bid to reclaim initiative. Each successive offensive excavated Germany's grave deeper. The ramifications radiated outward in expanding rings of disaster. For Germany, Barbarossa's failure initiated total war, mobilization under progressively desperate circumstances. Public morale deteriorated as casualty rosters lengthened, and the promised quick victory dissolved into endless attrition. Mothers received notices that their sons had frozen to death before Moscow. Wives discovered their husbands missing somewhere in the boundless Russian steppe. June 1941's confidence decayed into 1942's despair, then 43's, then 44's. For the Soviet Union, the triumph became a foundation of national identity that would legitimize the regime for generations. Moscow's successful defense converted terror into hope. Proving resistance was achievable. It was a psychological inflection point for the entire Soviet populace. Soviet propaganda celebrated Zhukov as Moscow's deliverer. The narrative of the Great Patriotic War would shape Soviet identity for decades. Yet the human toll, millions killed and entire cities demolished, left wounds that never fully mended. Soviet casualties by war's conclusion would surpass 20 million military and civilian dead. The victory was genuine, but it was purchased with oceans of blood. The parallel to Napoleon's 1812 invasion is inescapable. Both stemmed from logistical overextension, brutal climate, and fatal underestimation of Russian endurance. But the magnitude of German losses, and the aftermath, proved far greater, leading directly to Germany's absolute defeat and reshaping the post-war order. Napoleon at minimum survived a campaign again. Hitler had seized a wolf by the ears and could never release his grip. The bitter paradox: Hitler privately conceded the war was lost after Moscow, according to Halder's diary, yet publicly sustained the pretense of certain victory. He continued planning offensives until the Red Army reached Berlin in April 1945. Millions more would perish in a conflict whose conclusion was mathematically sealed by December 1941. The day Hitler understood Barbarossa was a fatal error wasn't a single day at all, but a season of gradual, agonizing comprehension, stretching from autumn 1941 through the frozen nightmare outside Moscow. A comprehension he would spend his remaining life struggling to reverse through increasingly desperate offensives, each accelerating the inescapable. We began with the vision of absolute confidence. 3 million German soldiers crossing into Soviet territory, assured of victory within weeks. Type: grave, intensity, medium. We conclude with the reality of 775,000 German casualties by December, frozen corpses before Moscow, and the first Soviet counteroffensive driving the Wehrmacht into retreat. The moment Hitler recognized he'd lost the war wasn't a solitary revelation. It was the accumulated mass of evidence that grew undeniable during the failed Moscow assault. The casualties that couldn't be replenished, the Soviet reserves that supposedly didn't exist, the tanks that outmatched German armor, the winter that German planners had discounted as trivial. Franz Halder documented the instant that burden became impossible to deny, Hitler's alleged declaration, "We have now lost the war." But recognition and acceptance remain entirely different things. The Führer would spend the subsequent 3.5 years waging a war he knew was lost, sacrificing millions more to postpone the unavoidable. The catastrophe before Moscow in December 1941 exposed a reality that ideological certainty had rendered invisible. You cannot subjugate a nation of 190 million with 3,350 tanks when they possess 10 to 13,000. You cannot prevail in a war of attrition against an adversary with superior population, resources, and territory. You cannot substitute racial delusions for military intelligence and anticipate anything except disaster. Barbarossa failed not in a single climactic moment, but across 1,000 logistical breakdowns, intelligence failures, and ideological fantasies that converted supreme confidence into existential catastrophe. The 775,000 German casualties by year's end represented merely the initial payment on a debt that would ultimately consume the Third Reich entirely. A fatal error acknowledged too late to avert, but early enough to comprehend the certain annihilation ahead. The wolf Hitler grasped by the ears in June 1941 would drag him and his regime to ruin by May 1945. Moscow was the moment he felt the wolf's jaws close around his wrist, but he never released his hold. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more fascinating World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.